Hi, everyone. Today is the August 5th, 2020 bi-weekly meeting of SIG Auth. It looks like we have kind of a light agenda. Can everybody see my screen? Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. Let's kick it off. Tim, you have the first item, core label policy. Do you want to give an intro?
Yeah. So this has come up a handful of times over the last few years, the idea of building a label policy into Kubernetes. There's even a proposal that got merged into the old community proposals folder. So the other, I guess that's one piece of context on this. The other piece of context is that more recently we've been talking about pushing a lot of policy out to webhooks. So things like scheduling policy, we were decided that we didn't really want to build that in as a core feature of Kubernetes. And we've also been talking about the future of pod security policy and maybe moving that out to a webhook. But I actually think, and I just kind of wanted to float this idea here. This isn't at the KEP stage or anything like that. But I think that label policy might be one of the few places where it really makes sense to build the policy controls into core Kubernetes. The main reason for that is that labels are a really useful way of keying other policy decisions. So if you want to create a policy that doesn't apply only at the namespace level, or for instance, policies on cluster scoped objects, then labels are a useful way of doing that. But you can't depend on labels for policy enforcement unless you have some way of protecting those labels themselves. And so this is one area where if we had some sort of built-in mechanism for protecting or restricting label access or even requiring certain labels, then we might be able to better apply policies outside of just labels. Another reason that I think label policy makes sense to build in is that essentially every object has labels on them. So this isn't something specific to one resource type. This is something that would be universal across all resources. And for something like Gatekeeper, this is a common use case, is to use Gatekeeper to enforce labels. But since every resource has labels on it, you need to make an admission decision on every single resource in the cluster. And that gets really expensive from a performance and scalability standpoint. So that's another reason for label policy. The last one is sort of an idea that's still baking, but I've kicked around some ideas with a few folks around having some sort of label delegation mechanism. So we have this problem where if I want to say that Tim isn't allowed to create this label on this on pods, then the problem is that I'm actually going to create deployment, and then the deployment controller creates the replica set, and the replica set controller creates the pod. And so there's this idea we've kind of talked about a little bit around some way of sort of chaining the labels down so that a controller can delegate that label decision to the owning object. Yeah, I do have a doc that kind of goes into that proposal a little more. I've been talking with Gerline. I don't know if she's on the call, but she's kind of working on putting together a more detailed proposal around this. But I did want to kind of float this idea and see what folks think about it.
A question about where this gets bounded. Are you going to try to create a way for something, an agent to label a resource that they're not otherwise allowed to mutate? Or is that outside the bounds of what you're looking at?
That's a bit more detailed than I've gotten. I don't have a clear picture of what the shape of this policy should look like. Like, do we want to have label defaulting? Do we want to have required labels? I think restricted labels is sort of the minimum of what I'd be looking for. Yeah.
So I think that kind of a label inheritance would be generally useful. Something like if a label grants permission, or I guess do you see these labels being used to grant more privilege or allow access to functionality, or do you think they would generally restrict access to functionality, or do you think both?
I think it could be both. It would depend on how the policy is set up. But I think with restricted labels, the kind of easiest way of thinking about that would be in terms of granting privilege. So maybe I have a policy that says you can't run privileged pods unless they have the label privileged on them, and then have some other mechanism that limits access to the privileged label.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is if they restrict permission, we care about them not being removed in sub trees, and if they grant permission, we care about them not being added, except for by some trusted subject. Could all policies that grant permission be modeled as like complement policies that restrict permission? Because I think that would simplify the model a little bit if we could say these only ever restrict.
So in that case, anyone would be able to add a label at any point, but the restrictions would only be on label removal?
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to reason about what this policy needs to control. If I'm like thinking in terms of like a SE Linux label, I want that label to be propagated if I label a process, I want that label to be propagated to files or network packets. And it seems like that would be useful from maybe label a namespace, propagate that to objects. I get a little fuzzy on how we propagate that from objects within a namespace, like a replica set to pods, because those aren't, I guess I don't think of that about that sort of hierarchy. But I think what the outcome is you start to kind of build a flexible scope to apply policy that isn't attached to our two-level resource hierarchy that we have right now. So
we have
yeah,
examples. Sorry, go ahead.
Examples.
I was going to say we have examples of labels we use on namespaces in OpenShift to control the range of valid UIDs for a pod. And it's not that they so much restrict as they are different, right? You have problems if someone can say like, no, I want to be between UID 1 and 10, right? Like that's bad in the same sense as being able to remove the restriction for UIDs at all. And it's not a complementary choice, right? It's a range.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense too. Yeah, so we can't really think about it in terms of a single category. I guess the traditional example is top secret, confidential, and unconfidential, where you don't want somebody acting in a confidential context to write an object in the unconfidential context, but they are able to write in a higher security context, like top secret. So we don't have that like single category of control with labels. I also, on the topic of delegation, I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I think it potentially helps, and I think that the use cases for something like this outside of delegation are enough to justify it. But I don't. Maybe I don't understand. Can you explain maybe in a little bit more depth of how you would see this used to implement user delegating permission to a controller or something?
Sure. So one idea we've talked about is suppose we have some way of granting permission. Let's just assume that all labels are restricted for now. Some hand waviness there, but some way of restricting labels. And some way of granting a user permission to use a label. So this would be something that would happen based on the user info on a mutating request. The controller would check, you're trying to add or change this label. Do you have permission to use this label? And so that would be on the initial object. So say creating let's just go with replica set because it's only one level. So I create a replica set, the controller checks, do I have permission to use the restricted labels on that replica set? Then when the replica set creates the pod, it sets the controller owner reference, which there can only be one of, on the pod. So when the pod is created, the permission check says, does the replica set controller have permission to use this restricted label? And the answer is no. But then it would check a second permission, which is, does it have some sort of controller permission, which might not even be necessary. It might be enough to just say, okay, this pod has a controller object. I guess we need some way of protecting what we set as the controller on the pod. But essentially it says the pod has a controller reference to the replica set, and the replica set has the restricted labels on it. Therefore, the pod is allowed to use those restricted labels, or maybe required. Required labels are useful, but there's they make the policy a lot more complicated.
And how would that work in the case where you have controllers that are horizontal, like autoscaler?
Well, the autoscaler wouldn't change the labels. It just changes the
okay.
Changes the number of replicas. But that's an interesting question. Like, what if you had some other controller that swaps out the image on this privileged replica set? That essentially gets permission to run arbitrary code under this restricted label.
You're kind of using owner ref as, I think it seems like you want sort of cause and effect that are objects, and you're using owner ref, or the object pointed to owner ref, as the cause of creating a new object. Does that make sense? And then you want to apply policy on the creation based on the cause.
Yeah, this is all about being able to tie the object back to the user that sort of kicked off the chain of events.
So
is there any
I have a
lesson?
question. A quick question. Would we want to also add labels to like subject access review so authorizers would be able to make decisions?
Labels aren't known during authorization time. So I wrote an authorizer long ago that was that used label selected policy in addition to other RBAC resources. But the only way to make it work was to wire through to admission as well. And that required extending admission to gets, because you end up having to filter the results that you got, right? Because you don't actually know the labels. When you're doing a get, you don't know a label until you've actually got the object, and there's no spot to intercept that. So I don't know that this is policy in the sense of RBAC, and nothing I really heard from Tim made me think he was trying to change that. Are you, Tim?
No, I think how the policy gets enforced, like, does Tim have permission to use this label, could potentially go through RBAC, but I'm not proposing that we plumb labels into authorization.
I think it's convenient that you only have to force this in mutating requests, which kind of lends itself to admission.
Well, it solves a different problem, right? Like if you want to show me the things with this label,
That's kind of what I was at.
It's indescribable still, right? But if you just want to be able to say, like, I know that some controller is going to use this to mean something different, and so I'm going to restrict you from being able to set it, that's a different purpose. So if I've understood it, I think Micah's question was about whether he'd be able to use this to inform authorization choices as opposed to just controller choices.
Right. Like so you're saying, yeah, labels aren't present for a get, but if I try to get pods with a specific label set, aren't labels at that point known, or is that not known to authorizer?
We don't plumb that through. Technically, that one could be provided.
Right. So if you didn't specify labels, it'd sort of be implicit all. But if you did specify, it could be a implicit subset.
So I think.
Anyway, yeah, it doesn't have to be for this. I'm just curious.
If I'm kind of reading yours and Tim's mind a little bit, the ultimate objective of having labels that are inherited through the system, that you have some guarantees around how that inheritance happens, ultimately that produces labels on objects that can be used as a policy attachment point. Tim mentioned earlier that like the gatekeeper thing would be useful, a gatekeeper policy would be useful to apply on labels. One other example is RBAC, as you mentioned. Is that kind of a reasonable generalization?
Yeah.
Is there? Oh, go ahead, Tim.
No, go ahead, CJ.
I was just going to say, is there a reason why we want to tie this back to a user and we couldn't instead tie it to a namespace? And, you know, one of the lessons from PSP was that it was super hard to try to do this level of policy tracing back to the creating user. And, you know, I don't know, maybe we're there with owner ref today and we weren't there before, but is it just that namespaces aren't, that it's still too hard to do stuff across multiple namespaces, that you have users that want to carve up namespaces in this way?
Yeah, I think there's still a little desire to subdivide namespaces, essentially. I agree. I'm not totally convinced we need it. I think the bigger win is the ability to apply it to cluster scoped objects, which we don't have a good solution for today. We don't have, I don't think there's a lot of policy that needs to be applied to cluster scoped objects, so we've sort of avoided it that way.
If you just had a policy around, so we're talking about policy, like the separate policy of what labels Tim is allowed to add and what labels Tim is allowed to remove. If you instead had policy, so if you had policy around what labels are allowed to be added and removed on which namespaces, including the no namespace, then you're just relying on the authorization rules for your cluster objects. If you can update a cluster level object, you could change its label as long as it's one of the labels that's allowed for cluster level objects. Is that insufficient for some case?
Yeah, I think there are cases where you want to like subdivide permissions on cluster scoped objects.
Like certain admins are able to change, I don't know, a persistent volume in one way, but you really only want other admins to be able to label a persistent volume, certainly.
I mean, we just did this for certificate signing requests in a kind of built-in ad hoc way, where specific signers have authorization to sign specific CSRs. Not sure if you would model that with labels, but we did subdivide a cluster scoped object there. Do you have any other use cases, Tim?
I feel like there's probably some use cases around CRDs. Permission to manage certain CRDs and maybe apply some policy to what the requirements around those are. It's a little hard to kind of separate this from policy enforcement and authorization, because if we're talking about authorization, like who has permission to administer or manage some set of CRDs or some set of cluster scoped objects, then you can just have explicit RBAC rules that list out all the things they're allowed to work on. I suppose label policy lets you do that a little more dynamically, but not convinced it's a requirement there.
Yeah, I think in general, it seems sound. We already have a proposal merged for it. I have not looked at that proposal in 4 years, but I think what I would be looking for if I were to review another one would be a pretty clear inheritance model. I think owner ref is one example, but I'm not sure how that works for like config maps. I guess it could work for config maps. I would have questions on whether it follows kind of namespace hierarchy. If labels are propagated from a namespace, restricted labels are propagated from a namespace and the owner ref. I'd want to understand like what the special super user authorization model looks like for either removing labels at a specific point or adding labels at a specific point. And I'd want to understand how this would be used in policy. So what the user story would be for RBAC gatekeeper network policy.
Those are all good questions. Would you mind adding them to the notes? I am currently logged out of my account and don't have access to the agenda. I did want to add, so my goal in raising this discussion today, since it's not, I'm not bringing a proposal explicitly. I sort of wanted to feel the water and see if it's worth, is it worth spending some time digging into this and coming up with a more detailed proposal. I'm sort of getting the impression that, like, yes, it's worth kind of continuing this discussion. Yeah, also thinking a bit about, as David put it, the bounds of the proposal. When it comes to the policy, it's not so much the delegation piece, but like what policy is actually applied. There's some questions around whether it would be mutating or just validating. So like, do we want any sort of defaulting or required labels, or is it just restrictions on use? Do we care about enforcing policy on label values or only on label keys? When you get into requiring labels and restricting labels, you run into the possibility of conflicts that we know about, mixing mutation and validation, or multiple mutations. But if you only have control over label keys, then conflicts are less of an issue. It doesn't completely go away, but so yeah, I guess we could try and hash this out in more of a detailed proposal, but I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on those pieces.
Yeah, whenever I think about systems like this, I also always think of the person who has to unpick it in an incident response scenario, or the auditor who has to like explain why this thing has access. So I think like if we're going to add like an extra layer of kind of built-in access control here, we need to keep in mind like how do I know who has access to what, and why was it allowed to do that thing? And hopefully like not build a system where the answer is so impenetrable that it's like really hard to figure that out. Yeah.
I agree with that. Also, you reminded me of one of the use cases for subdividing namespaces, which is maybe I want to enforce this policy on a namespace, but then some controller ends up getting deployed in the namespace that needs an exception. So it has a legitimate use case for violating that policy. Maybe the operators go through the appropriate channels to get approval for an exception, but they don't necessarily want to just grant a blanket exception to the namespace, and they don't want to require that the controller be moved into a separate namespace and then need to deal with cross namespace issues. And so it would be nice to be able to say, okay, we're gonna put this exception label on this object that opts it out of this policy enforcement.
I'm still probably -1 on trying to subdivide namespaces in that way. I think namespace subdivision has proven to be difficult to get right and to explain to anyone in a usable way when we've tried to do it in the past, right? You think about like I want to have rules around who can mount which secret. It was really difficult to explain, and we've ended up removing the feature.
Tim, do you have any ideas on like a concrete example of what sort of operator might want in that situation, just to make it concrete?
The answer is yes. The question is, can I remember them?
I also sort of lean towards the curmudgeon-y, like, oh, let's not change stuff, but I feel like there is a use case there that I want to, see if I can make it work in my head with just what, namespaces and interesting RBAC and admission.
Yeah, I think I'll have to think on that a little more. It's definitely come up before, but it's not coming to me right now. One thing on subdividing namespaces, maybe the hierarchical namespace controller that the multi-tenancy group is working on will address some of those use cases. But I've definitely also kind of blanking on the examples right now, but I've talked to teams before that were asking, what's the right way of granting elevated permissions to this thing in this namespace? And my sort of default answer was, just put it in a different namespace. Why does it need to be in the same namespace? There were, apparently my brain is not working right now. This is what I get for joining a meeting while on vacation. But yeah, there were some issues with like, well, what if this thing wants to manage a secret? Yes, you can kind of grant the RBAC permissions to manage the secret and kind of do that explicitly, but it gets a lot more complicated that way. Yeah. I'll have to think about that more, but I agree that any proposal should have concrete use cases in it.
Yeah, I think that's the next step for you, Tim, if you want this. Did anybody have anything else on that, or should we send Tim off to write a KEP? Awesome. That was a very interesting discussion. Thank you, Tim. Shihong, bound service account, token volume, beta. Is this a KEP right now?
There's an update to the existing KEP. Let me send the the link in the chat.
I think I found it.
Okay, cool.
All right, cool. Do you want to give a summary of what you're changing?
So basically, we try to graduate this feature to GA, to beta, and which means this feature will be turned on by default, and so the old service account admission controller will the old one will inject the secret-based service account token into the pod. With this feature, we'll use the service account, the projected service account token, which has a better security properties. So in this update, it lists some migration frictions that we have already solved in the notes, and also the biggest challenge is all the existing workloads are using the old secret based tokens, which will not expire. With this new one, the token by default, the expiration is 16 minutes. So if the workload doesn't reload the token, it will break after 1 hour. So
Yeah. Would we turn this on with warn after, or would we say to turn on warn after in a release note or something, if people are concerned about that?
yeah, you definitely need to like put this into a release note, right? I think right now bringing this up in this meeting is to raise some, because this is a big change. I just want to know, like, are there any concerns from people that with this feature turned on by default?
Yeah, I think this is one of the scariest things we've turned on, probably, as far as making people upset. Jordan, it looks like you reviewed the KEP already.
Yeah.
Do you have any high-level thoughts?
I agree that this is a really fundamental thing. I am not sure what we want to do about the warn after aspect, whether we want to default it on or off. Yeah, I guess if cluster administrators are not currently giving us signing keys, then they would have to change their invocations to start providing signing keys to the API server.
Which we are potentially going to do independent of this as part of adding token requests and token volume projection to conformance.
Right. If there's awareness of changing the API server configuration related to this feature, then I'm less concerned about them needing to understand which mode they want to go in. Like go into short-lived token mode and monitor their workloads, or go into long-lived token mode and monitor their metrics. It's the administrators that have already set up signing keys and would like silently switch behavior because the API server in 120, I guess, would just default to the the shorter-lived tokens, they're the ones that I'm concerned about. So someone who has an API server invocation that would be perfectly happy like switching the default, it already has signing keys, it already has everything it needs, and we're going to change the default on them. Another option is to not have a default for the warn after and make them pick one way or the other. So
when we move the token request and token request projection into GA, those flags will be required. We just allow the clusters with the token request and token request project enabled to switch over.
Well, I think after the GA of token request and token projection, that will be all clusters. Did I understand your question correctly?
Yeah.
So in my mind, the main question is whether we silently default to the new thing or whether we make them choose what mode they want to operate in, short-lived or long-lived bound tokens. David, do you have thoughts?
I think my changes are going to be easier if my changes aren't going to be easy no matter what we do. Choosing a value at least lets me know that I failed. Hopefully everyone has a canary deployment of some kind and can update it, but you can see like if you suddenly have to specify something and you can't specify it in the release before and you aren't used to that sort of an upgrade model, because we don't generally do that.
You can specify it in the release before.
It is
So
the values there.
The ability to warn, to configure the API server to warn on bound token expiration is in 119.
Okay. Oh. Yeah. I don't think any choice here is going to make it easy for people.
I'm mostly wondering what components like kubeatom will do. So they are an installer, but they don't actually have knowledge of the particular workloads running in their cluster. So they're an installer, yeah, without knowledge of the particular characteristics of the deployment, what's on top of the deployment. So would they probably opt in by default to the extended expiration and describe to their users, like, if you want shorter, here's how you can get shorter. And in the meantime, like, this is the release to be monitoring your workloads for these metrics. And if that's the sort of thing that kubeatom would do, is that the sort of thing that we should just make the API server do by default? Like enable it, but opt into the, enable it, but with the extended token expiration for some number of releases and say, like, this is on by default now, it won't mess up your workloads, they'll have a token that's good for a year. If you want to override it, here's how you override it. And X releases down the road. So if it goes to beta now and then we get X releases of experience with it, then here's when we plan to change that default to be short-lived. That's one possibility. It starts getting the better security properties without breaking workloads and automatically gives admins the monitoring that they need. yeah, off the top of my head, that seems like the friendliest thing to do. And someone who wants like really strict security properties can get it by overriding that. But I don't know. What do you think?
That sounds reasonable to me. And in that phase where we are defaulting to enabled, just have a action required release note every release, and be noisy about it. But yeah, even warn after, assuming we haven't subtly broken compatibility in some way, which I don't think we have at this point. That is an improvement from what we currently do with secrets. That seems like the most palatable option I've heard so far.
It's my middle name, Jordan, the most palatable option I've heard so far.
Look at it.
Yeah, ask him how he got married.
What do we want to do about token controller?
I think we leave it running until the API and the admission injected tokens are GA. And then we can start thinking about how we want to phase it out. But I see that as a separate thing. There are people who are manually creating tokens who are manually creating tokens expecting them to be populated by the controller. One possibility is to switch the controller to use the bound token API to do that population. So if you create a secret that has the annotations that indicates and the type that indicates you want a token, the token controller could use the bound token API to mint that token and bind it to that secret. So that was one of the reasons we allowed secrets as a bound object in addition to pods. So I would probably think about like the time frame in which we would want to do that and start considering how to do that. The thing that worries me the most is that there are people who are not actually creating secrets with the annotations to indicate they want a token. They're just waiting for a secret to show up. We don't have visibility to that usage. And I'm pretty confident that that usage exists, where someone creates a service account and then they just watch for secrets to wait for the automatically created one.
Yep.
So that is the thing that I think we need to be the loudest about. So if we want to go ahead and start communicating, like if you're scraping tokens out of secrets for use outside pods, you should be explicitly creating a secret for that. And really, we would like them to switch to the bound token API. So if that's what we want them to do long term, it might be better to wait until that bound token API is GA, and then we can tell them, like, unconditionally, do it this way. It's a better API for them because they can do it synchronously instead of this like weird make a secret with annotation and then wait. So maybe wait till the token API is GA, tell them to switch to that, and then some number of releases later, stop the automatic secret creation and only satisfy explicitly created secrets. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to address this separately. Speaking of token request GA, do you think there's anything blocking token request or token volume projection from GA other than maybe whether we added to conformance at this point? Or is that ready to go for 120?
Yeah, as far as I know, it's ready.
Jihang, did you have anything else you wanted to bring up? All right. Any other asks from
No,
SIG?
I think the plan there sounds pretty reasonable. Enable the run after for a couple of releases.
Okay, I think the best thing we can do at this point is to have everybody who cares about this go review the KEP. Awesome. Did anybody else have anything? We have 5 minutes left. Should we go through the bugs now or do this offline? I'm not sure if we have enough time to get through 15 of these in 5 minutes. I'm going to move to table this for offline bug scrubbing. I will take that as agreement. Thank you everyone for joining SIG Auth. See you guys in 2 weeks.